I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our fall 2023 Axel Springer lecture entitled The Contamination of History by Professor Holly Case of Brown University. The Axel Springer Fellowship was established in 2003, so very early in the Academy's history, and if you haven't heard already, this is our 25th anniversary year. So it was established with the aim to promote German-American dialogue in the fields of media, public policy, and other areas of contemporary concern. The Axel Springer Fellow is selected annually and may be from an academic, journalistic, or public policy background. We are deeply grateful to the Axel Springer Company and its CEO and longtime Academy trustee, Matthias Döpfner, for both of their dedicated support over the year. I'm particularly pleased to welcome Jacques Schuster. Jacques, wo bist du? Da bist du. For joining us today, Jacques is the chief political editor. Is that the correct title? Yes, I got it right. Chief political editor of Die Welt and its chief commentator as well, and I'm delighted he's here. So being the president of the Academy is a truly august position. And in this case, it entitles me to introduce the introducer for tonight's event. Which is a shame, because I had a lot of nice things I really wanted to say about Holly, but I won't get that chance. But Holly has been a fantastic addition to the Academy this fall, and every conversation with her is absolutely fascinating. However, tonight, her introducer will be Bertha Mühlhoff, who is a journalist, an author, and a translator. Her work has appeared in such publications as Die Epilogue, Edit, Merkur, Süddeutsche Zeitung, and Zeit Online. She has studied philosophy and art history in both Hamburg and Paris. Her most recent translation is Christopher Blattman's Why We Fight, The Roots of War and Paths to Peace, in German, Warum wir Kriege führen und wie wir sie beenden können. And for those of you who don't know, Christopher Blattman is one of the really great social scientists at work. Today he's a professor at the University of Chicago, so I recommend anything he's written. So before I turn over the stage to Bertha, who will get to say all those nice things about Holly, let me just give you a roadmap to this evening. Holly will give a brief sort of 10-minute introduction into her topic, taint tracing, after which Bertha will join her on stage and they will have a conversation. Holly and Bertha will then open it up for questions from those of you here and people who are watching us at home. So if you are here in the room, I guess you understand the basics of how to ask a question. If you're at home, don't raise your hand on the Zoom platform. Type your question into the Q&A section of the Zoom platform. And with that, Bertha, the microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, and good evening. Dear guests and dear Holly, I am truly honored to be here tonight for this conversation. And actually, I thought it was not necessary to introduce her. And I am convinced that it is always better to speak with someone than about them if one has the chance. So I will cut this very short. I'm almost done already. Let me just add that since I first met Holly, I think it was in 2017, and I was still a student of philosophy in Paris. And I was on a transatlantic flight to New York City because I wanted to see New York City. But there also was a conference of history. So I wasn't invited. It was my partner who was. Anyhow, I had a lot of time, and history papers can be very interesting, so I read them all. And I came across Holly's, and it was just puzzling to me because, no, I don't know why exactly, and I still can't say. After those years in which I was a happy, very grateful participant of her reading groups and her summer schools that she's organizing for young students or young scholars from around the world. And I still can't say what exactly that is that she's doing. It's history, it's thorough history, like she's, as you know, a expert on Eastern Europe. But it's also philosophy, or it's transgressing history, or it's searching for patterns in history that might resonate with the present, while at the same time being extremely wary about patterns and pattern searching and thinking in patterns. So I am very excited and curious to see her new project in this very infancy, and to finally understand how she gets to these amazing questions she asks about history. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Dan and to all the staff here at the Academy. I've been here, it seems like, just a short time, but it's been so incredible already. I'm sure I'll never live this well again. And Beate, it's such a joy to be in the same room with her always, but also with my fellow fellows who are quite wonderful. And to all of you who came and all of you watching online, and to posterity, thanks for listening if you do. So I'm often the last to catch on to things. It was the mid-1990s before I knew what or maybe who Led Zeppelin was. I'm ashamed to say it, but I still don't quite know what political economy is, though I've been practicing using the words in a sentence in front of the mirror.
This is because of the political economy of relations.
You can see I'm making some good progress there. So imagine my surprise when sometime around the late autumn of 2016, I finally half understood what is meant by the word zeitgeist. I realized I had been in one and that it was disappearing, or that it had changed. Other people were, of course, way ahead of me on this, as usual. But sometimes if you show up late enough to something, you kind of have the field to yourself, and you don't have to jostle to reach the buffet. So here I was with this new experience of a zeitgeist, wondering what to do. And there were still some people at the buffet, ghosts mainly. Goethe was there and didn't seem much surprised to see me. We knew each other from before. There was Hegel and Marx, and I tried to sit down next to Hannah Arendt, but she was arguing with Martin Heidegger the whole time. I admit I was a little afraid to approach Walter Benjamin because I was pretty sure he was going to say something that would make it impossible to eat anything ever again, even metaphorically. And I was really hungry. So that's where I've been since 2016, at the Philosophy of History buffet, trying to figure out what it is I should be trying to figure out. And all I had was one question. Why is it so difficult to imagine a better future? In advance of the 78th Annual UN General Assembly, last week President Biden shared a video in which he mentioned the challenges of the future: conflict, climate change, corruption. Together and only together we can bend the arc of history in a better direction, he said. The world is depending on the United Nations to master our challenges and prove ourselves capable of forging a better future for humankind. A better future for humankind, it sounds good, but it also sounds like it comes from another time. an earlier one. You can almost hear it said with radio static. It even rhymes with a line from the 1941 Atlantic Charter, A Better Future of the World. And when Biden says we can bend the arc of history, that rhymes with what Martin Luther King Jr. said in 1968. We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. In a weird way, talk of a better future actually sounds like a blast from the past. And the past certainly has its comforts and its attractions for many. The Bulgarian novelist Georgi Gospodinov, in his latest novel Time Shelter, imagines people bunkering down in the past. The time is coming, one character says, when more and more people will want to hide in the cave of the past to turn back, and not for happy reasons, by the way. We need to be ready with the bomb shelter of the past. Call it the time shelter, if you will. We face many sub-zero problems. I call them sub-zero because they're the kind of problems for which you can't imagine better futures. Just somewhat less catastrophic ones. By the way, the green was also my idea. In 2008, the Canadian naturalist and writer Farley Moat spoke to an interviewer on Canadian television about his view of a better future. The truth about us is that we're a bad species. We probably have doomed ourselves already. Now, I don't find this an oppressive concept or conclusion. It is not pessimistic, it is optimistic, because with our elimination, and we are going to eliminate ourselves, life will carry on, and it will be as if we have never existed on this earth, and the earth will be green where it should be green, and blue where it should be blue, and there will be lots of life without us. In 2013, the American intellectual and writer Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote, "I don't believe the arc of the universe bends towards justice. I don't even believe in an arc. I believe in chaos. I believe powerful people who think they can make utopia out of chaos should be watched closely. I don't know that it all ends badly, but I think it probably does." Today, the broader consensus seems to be that we live in a contaminated world, contaminated by the hubris, the cruelties, and the mistakes of the past, and that we are submerged in and part of, and that it's hard to imagine will ever go away. Whereas the question of the 19th century was, was tun, what is to be done? The question of our century seems to be, what have you or what have we done? A lot of our stories trace the contamination of today's world back to some origin or source. This will be familiar to Germans. There's a lot of history writing dedicated to seeking the historical roots of Nazism, going back to the Enlightenment or to Romanticism or to the so-called German Sonderweg or separate path to modernity. Many of those who did this agreed with the assertion of the German historian Reinhard Koselleck that man as historical being is always responsible for the intended and unintended consequences of his actions, and for the latter perhaps more than for the former. But not everyone who looks for sources of past contamination has shared Koselleck's self-critical view. Symbolic politics has oftentimes been used to trace contamination back to the horrors of the last century, but with something more of a cynical and instrumental aim, one that is self-aggrandizing rather than self-critical. In a speech from February 24th, 2022, the day Russia invaded Ukraine, President Vladimir Putin argued that the purpose of the war was to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, and predicted that Ukraine and its supporters in the West would kill innocent people just as members of the punitive units of Ukrainian nationalists and Hitler's accomplices did during the Great Patriotic War. His prediction suggested that the drive for Ukrainian independence would remain forever tainted by some Ukrainians' collaboration with Nazi Germany during the Second World War, and in this case, a World War II story is used more to justify atrocity and murder than to prevent it. The same was true during the 1990s wars of Yugoslav secession, just as the political symbolism of the emergent independent states recalled that of right-wing and collaborationist military formations from the Second World War. Arguments about contaminated or tainted histories multiplied and were used to justify war and ethnic cleansing. Ukrainians, meanwhile, have their own taint-tracing narratives about Russia and Russians, that Russian statehood and aims have always been treacherous and have not changed over the course of history, or the idea that Ukrainians and Russians had a shared version of a glorious World War II history that was the reason why Ukrainian soldiers mistakenly did not shoot Russian invaders in Crimea in 2014. So even the good parts of the story are tainted. Generally speaking, the 1930s and World War II come up a lot in contamination stories, both backwards and forwards, and these experiences and their histories have a significance far beyond European regional debates and conflicts. The mid-20th century continues to haunt perspectives on the future. Historian and post-colonial theorist Dipesh Chakrabarty, imagining future climate catastrophe rather than past wartime atrocity, observed, citing the German philosopher Theodor Adorno, that a major aim of the Enlightenment was to help humans overcome fear. One of the most prominent and indeed official manifestations of this aim was again the 1941 Atlantic Charter, which was the World War II Western Allies' answer to Nazism and freedom from fear, figures prominently in it. For his part, Chakrabarty became interested in this conception, concluding, however, I grew up in a place, India, where fear was very much still a part of my life, something about that reverence has to be brought back. And so in a way, it's back, but also forward to fear. In his book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, Learning to Fight in a World on Fire, the Swedish human ecologist Andreas Malm wrote of the necessity of reviving a pugnaciousness in the face of hopelessness, and that we will have to think, he said, like Jews who knew they would be killed in the Warsaw Ghetto during World War II and nonetheless undertook heroic acts of resistance. The research that does suggest that some tipping points might have been already crossed with climate change only underscores the need for emergency tactics. If more points are crossed, that need rises further still until, in the worst case, the time comes for Warsaw. Then, of course, there's artificial intelligence, which has its own mid-century contamination story. Like that cybernetics was derived to create weapons during the Second World War, and that this person, Norbert Wiener, started saying cybernetics applies not just to airplanes and anti-aircraft weaponry, but to human and animal behavior as well. And then he and his colleagues actually started applying it to humans and animals. And here we are. The horrors of the middle of the 20th century, once viewed as part of the past to be overcome, are now being regularly projected onto the present and even into the future. The contamination spreads still further across time and space, and not only does it seem that there's no place that is free of it, there's also no time either. And there's not even a form of being, not human, not non-human, not machine, that's outside of it. Historians have a strange way of comforting people. They say, this horrific reality you're facing is nothing new. Cold comfort, to be sure, but it's true of this contamination matter too. Some of it's really old. Historically, often someone was considered tainted or contaminated in contrast to someone else. During the period of the early modern European colonization, for example, Europeans were torn between viewing indigenous peoples as pristine and unfallen against the tainted Western civilization and thinking it the other way around, that Western civilization is pure and others are tainted. The desire to achieve or preserve purity and to fight contamination has a very long history of its own. The Inquisition, the Crusades, anti-Semitism, the Stalinist purges, the Cultural Revolution, jihad, ethnic cleansing, have all been framed as attempts to escape contamination and come out clean. More recently, the science fiction writer N.K. Jemisin has written of the taint of our world and fantasized in fiction about quarantine and harsh enforcement to cleanse the world of supremacist prejudice. There is only one treatment for this toxin once it gets into the blood, fighting it tooth and nail, spear and claw, up close and brutal. No quarter can be given, no parole, no debate. I'm not a small person, but this contamination problem makes me feel really small, both physically and temporally. What's a historian to do in the face of all this? Is history even the right place to begin? Somehow I think so, because a lot of what we've been talking about looks like history, but then it gets thought bigger and bigger and starts to spread and spread until it's not about context. And it's not about change over time at all. It's about not change and about all time. The German-American philosopher Hannah Arendt reflected in one of her writings on the moment when Ulysses, at the court of the king of the Phaeacians, listened to the story of his own deeds and sufferings, to the story of his life, now a thing outside himself, an object for all to see and to hear. What had been sheer occurrence now became history. The reconciliation with reality, the catharsis, came about through the tears of remembrance. The deepest human motive for history and poetry appears here in unparalleled purity, since listener, actor, and sufferer are the same person. Ulysses himself would have been bored rather than moved if history were only news and poetry only entertainment. If history or telling and hearing stories about ourselves used to be how people sought reconciliation with reality, I think that's starting to change. I'm going to do something a little strange here right at the end, so brace yourselves because it's about to get weird. Let's go back to my highly original cartoon. You can see that I was drawing on the other side of the paper too, and it shows through a little. On the other side, I drew a mushroom and an octopus. I think it's from mushrooms and octopuses that people get reconciliation with reality today. Mushrooms are networks and networked, we're told, just like us, only environmentally sound, unlike us. They share information in a way that's good for the whole system, just like we should, but often we don't. And that's not at all scary for mushrooms, unlike the internet, which is very scary. Mushrooms gather up and remove toxins, yet somehow still survive and thrive, which we'll have to learn to do. Mushrooms also have a kind of distributed intelligence, and in order to think like this, a lot of people had to get high on magic mushrooms, because when you're on mushrooms, this is how the world looks: interconnected, simultaneous, meaningful. So you are the mushroom already, and you want to be more like the mushroom, and the mushroom is inside, outside, and everywhere. Mushroom thinking offers reconciliation with reality, or catharsis for our time. Similarly, with octopuses. Remember how spines used to be fetishized and good? Now spines are out. The octopus has no spine, so it can slip through very small holes. It also has a strange, inscrutable intelligence. It can lose a limb and grow it back, like we should. It can change its color and disappear in the background to escape danger, which who hasn't wanted to do that in the workplace or other places? These are all characteristics one needs in our time. We have to be strangely, flexibly smart, incredibly adaptable, and very rubbery and resilient, because we'll have to change jobs, adapt to new worldviews, wholly new labor conditions, climate change, etc., etc. Think like the octopus. Be the octopus. But for God's sake, don't eat the octopus. In that respect, octopuses are very different from mushrooms. Octopus thinking offers reconciliation with the reality, or catharsis, for our time. But what's remarkable about these examples is that they're not metaphors or stories or histories, really. If you think of it in terms of music, History is a melody. One note follows the next. What we have with octopuses and mushrooms is not a melody. It's a chord. Judging from how our way of reconciliation with reality has ceased to be allegories or stories and become instead chords, something peculiar has happened to history, and I mean to get to the bottom of this. Thank you.
Holly, history is reconciliation with reality. This I found interesting. Mm-hmm. I thought, and now mushrooms and octopi are reconciliations with reality. So are they also reconciliations with the future? Can they be?
This is good. I should tell the audience that we decided not to give each other questions in advance, and now I'm regretting this. No, but this is a very good question. Okay, so I think what's interesting to me about octopuses and mushrooms, and what I mean by chord, is that history is gone from this version. So, you know, you used to have metaphors where history would be built into them. Like, let's say, like the metaphor of the stream that you can only step in once, and history is in there somewhere. Or, you know, it would be built into, like, if you're a butterfly, then you change. Like, you start out as a worm, and then you become a butterfly. There's change over time that's built into a lot of metaphors. But these metaphors, there's no change over time built into them. And also they function at very different levels. So they function both as examples to follow, but something that you already are, and then as something kind of third, which is something that you know, like in the case of mushrooms, it's something that conditions your thinking. Like the mushroom itself gets you to think like a mushroom, and it's thinking like a mushroom that you have to do. And so it's sort of, you know, like in some respects, the future is missing here too. It's not exactly missing. It's just the point is not there's a past, there's a future, but that there is this, you know, like there is this layer of significances and meanings. And I've seen this, you know, I gave the sort of flip example of mushrooms and octopuses because, well, I think everyone has probably heard of these network ideas and these very nice ideas about octopuses, and they've probably seen the film and all of that. My octopus teacher, but I keep seeing this over and over again in various places where some metaphor serves multiple functions simultaneously, and that it's not exactly, you know, stasis or sustained, because that implies change over time. This, once again, is a method of dealing with change over time, but the metaphor itself does not accommodate that at all. You know, like it's not about that. And so whether they can get us ready for the future, I think they get us ready for not thinking about the future. And whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, you know, like, interesting.
And if there's historical change, we could just take another animal that's more suitable to our metaphorical needs.
Well, and I do think, you know, like that these metaphors coexist with, it's not like this is absolutely and totally the thinking world that we exist in. And the old kinds of metaphors still exist. And other animals, you know, like have their own, or not just animals, but all kinds of things can be metaphors that function in the old way. But the question for me is like, how would you notice if something new was happening, something weird? Because you would only have your old categories for describing it. And somehow these are metaphors. And somehow a little bit they do work like metaphors, but there's something weird about the way they work too that's not quite right. It doesn't quite fit. And so, you know, like, I think we could use another animal when we want history, back. And the question is, like, to what extent, you know, like, should we fight the chord? Because there is some, you know, a lot of metaphors. When I talk about coming to terms with a reconciliation with reality, like, I guess we all presume that on some level, you know, you want to be reconciled with some reality, but on some level, like, you want to know when you should not be reconciled to the reality. And what does fighting like a harmonic chordulum metaphor even look like? I think there you have to, even the modes of confronting it would have to be different than the earlier modes because it functions differently.
Yeah. Yeah, when I was asking about reconciliation with the future, I was thinking myself, well, that's paradoxical. How can you be reconciled? You always are reconciled with something that's past.
Oh, that's good.
Right?
Yeah.
But I was wondering, maybe there is a sort of longing for reconciliation with that is to come.
Yeah.
And I had to think about this because you were, in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned this image of the bending arc of history. Like, and that is kind of implying that there could be, like there is actually an arc that stretches from here or from the past to the future, and we can kind of bend it or reconcile it or modify it.
I like this. Yeah.
How?
I like this, that you've introduced the paradox of reconciliation with, something that hasn't happened yet. Because I do think that, like with some version of the modern, we entered into this weird relationship with historical time. Like when the French revolutionaries tried to choose their judges from posterity. Like they say, well, nobody here is going to be a fair judge of what we're doing, so let's take the future. And so I think this notion that the future has something to say about now, something legitimate and something super legitimate to say about now, is part of like what is like pretty modern. I think maybe if I were to try to think about like how you get chords out of this, because that's not what the French revolutionaries were doing. They weren't making octopuses and mushrooms. And I think part of that has to do with, if you're doing this iteratively over a long period of time, then it's very, like the relationship to the past gets very strange. And let's say I'm intrigued by a video that was made by AOC about the Green New Deal. And the way she made the video was that she projected a future when the Green New Deal would have been implemented and all of its achievements were sort of in the past. Mm-hmm. So she looks at now as if it's, like 20 years ago, and that they've achieved all of this stuff, and thank heavens they did all of this stuff. And I can see completely why she did it that way. But if you think the way that is generally thought about the past, you can't really imagine a future that's going to look back 20 years and say, wow, really great stuff was going on, because that is absolutely not our relationship to the past. And we don't, like Hannah Arendt said, that there was, she used a metaphor of a table, and that, like some version of the progress narrative didn't have any way to treat like the nails that went into building a table. So the notion that, like some table should be built, yes, but almost no tables ever get finished. And let's say some tables get smashed, or some people thought we shouldn't have been making a table, we should have been making a chair. And every nail that went into every, aspirationist project is meaningless or worse. And so, like she posits this as some kind of problem. And Leah Upi, who's she's an Albanian writer who came out of 1980s Albania as a child, went through the 1990s, and then comes back to Marxism. One thing that she tries to do is try to develop a relationship to the past that doesn't just push it away. And that's incredibly hard. It's incredibly hard. And, especially since a lot of her family members were imprisoned, killed under state socialism. And as a Marxist, she has a lot to explain. And so how is it that you don't throw away those nails? But, how many nails are you going to, how many meaningless lives in perpetuity, can there be? And what kind of, how do people become motivated to pose the question or to say, I want to do something, if everything that was done in the past is like a heap of tossed out nails? and this is a problem with this reconciliation with the future matter that I think has become very sharp, because it's sort of about what will it mean what I have been doing.
Yeah. So, if I understand correctly, what you were saying is that it's the future is always very strict with the past, or critical, mostly. But is this not historically like coming in waves, or like a child growing up and then it has to go through puberty when, everything is bad, parents bad, and, and then at some point the waves go smooth, and one can look at the past in a better light, in a warmer light.
Yeah, no, I do think that.
Or are we stuck in a very critical, harsh light?
I would say that two things. One is, if I were to say we were terminally stuck, I would be a really crappy historian. No, this is it. But I also think that we think we're stuck, and that some version, and the bigger matter is, and this has elements of problem, but it also has elements of just what does this mean. The bigger matter is that a lot of things don't work the same way that they did. So, for example, causes are explanations for things. They break down more readily. So, historically, you would have, the historian would have localized, contextualized explanations for things that happen. And, there's structuralism that would explain why similar things can happen in two different places. But now you have multiple forces that are both contextual and structural and diffusionist, because of the internet gets things that fast to those places. And so context is no longer what we thought it was, especially when it's a non-trivial context what happens on the internet. And the internet is not a place, it's not a time. And things get juxtaposed within it contextually. They get rank ordered. That's a kind of context, but it's not a kind of context that we as historians have trained ourselves to take seriously and to imagine, okay, what does the history of the future look like, or the history of the present, if context doesn't work like it did in the past? And so even our causal explanations are a little, they're broken, or they're broken for some purposes, or this is part of the reason why I think we get this harmonic, this chord type phenomenon. In short.
Thank you. I thought about, you said the causes are broken, also predictability is broken.
Oh, predictability.
Maybe?
Predictability. Yeah. On the one hand, yes. Because predictability, or did you want to add something to that question?
No, just thinking about climate change. It's not that it changes and then we are Italy and Germany, right? But the change is about, we don't know what comes. And the same for AI. So in general, there's, I think, more unpredictability around.
Yeah. And yet there is also more of the sort of predictability that is meant, or the sort of prediction that is meant to condition behavior. So there is a strong tendency, whenever we're engaging with algorithms, for example, we are engaging with an attempt to be able to more solidly predict at least some narrow future outcome. And even context functions this way. So if you sit in on talks by neuroscientists, for example, context for them is whether if you have a question like, if a person is offered 50 cents with a 2/3 chance, or a dollar with a 1/3 chance, and you put the first choice up here and the second choice down here, which one will they choose? Or if you flip them, which one? That's context for them.
Yeah.
And the reason why that interests them is because they want to know, like, okay, let's say I want this outcome on the back end, or others want to know why you want this outcome in the back end. How can you produce that outcome with greater likelihood? And that taps not so much into my individual experience as a historical being. It taps into some version of behaviorism, like some version of I would call this era, it's not really historicism, it's more like psychologism. That its ultimate explanatory causes, the ones that it's most interested in, are psychological. And, it has two aims. One aim is, to gather lots of data to refine its predictive capacities, but also to very personalize data so that it comes down as close to the individual person as possible to be able to predict individual behaviors. And so on the one hand, it wants to be able to predict aggregates, but it also, in wanting to predict them, wants to condition them. I mean, who doesn't, there's something about this that isn't unique to algorithms. It's sort of what historians hope to do, but we're not very good at it. Like you come up with some method or conclusion, or you draw some pieces from the past, and you hope that by telling the world it's going to produce outcomes that you want. And so in some ways, this mode of thinking is not unique to the way people, but the scale of it is and this is where I think a change in scale is an absolute change in kind. Like this predictive capacity is very different, and the desire for prediction is very different. Actually, Kant said something about this. He said, isn't it interesting when you're looking at a lot of people and that their actions look kind of random, but then when you start basically gathering information on aggregates, that you start to be able to see that there are patterns that emerge. And so this notion that with more information and with a more complete record, you have better capacity to understand and therefore also predict is an old dream. But the scale at which it's being undertaken and at which it's being fed back down as not just predictive, but as, like a push factor, is huge.
And it's kind of funny that there is the possibility to predict, but the overall thing, I will stick to my opinion that there is an unpredictability.
Oh, totally. Yes.
But it's a weird coincidence of, we finally can do it, but we feel like it's unpredictable what comes out of it, of our prediction.
Oh, this is good because, this unpredictability of the future, I think, is the old untamable. If you look at the origins of history, a lot of it is in oracular readings. And so the oracle bones in China, for example, they're some of the first history records, but they were meant to be predictions. And the reason why they were kept and preserved is so that they could tell, so they could get better at prediction. And, so they could say in retrospect, oh, this one turned out to be right, this one turned out to be wrong, and so we can, refine our predictive capacities based on, this record that we have of successful and failed predictions, and also the people who break the bones better, make the better predictions are the ones who then get favored in oracular terms. And so, even at its very origin, unpredictability, or that horizon of the future that can't be said is one of the deep origins of history, because it's the way that it's a record of all of our crappy predictions of the past, in a way.
Thank you. We didn't talk about tainted or taint now at all, but I think we could open it to the public.
Let's do
Even
it.
though we didn't get a sign yet, but I have my watch.
Oh no, he gave us a sign. It was just now.
I didn't see it.
Yeah.
Just now. So if there are any questions already, otherwise we...
Good, I think there.
I don't have a question on taint, but there are hands, yes. Oh yeah, sorry, it's a... Please. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know if any of this. Just a simple, very simple question. Thank you very much. It's all very interesting. And I think I have a feeling of how you're going to approach your project and how you're going to write. But what are you going to write about? I'm just sort of curious. That's okay. I'm sort of, I don't mean this as a joke. It's just sort of a chance for you to expand a little.
Yeah, I think you've confronted Beata's predicament. What is this exactly? Formally, I have 4 things that I'm looking at. So one is symbolic politics around the war in Ukraine and the wars of Yugoslav secession, where taint tracing narratives are being undertaken. And the 2 other ones are about cybernetics and dirty data. So cybernetics, which there's an argument about it, and I very shorthanded it here, that suggests that because it was born during the Second World War, it carries the ontology of the enemy, and also because it functions in accord as a the mechanism is called that Wiener or that derives is called a servo mechanism, and basically a servo mechanism is something that takes some path snippet out of the past and carries it forward. And so it's even built into cybernetics is a notion of how some part of the past conditions the future. And so the reason cybernetics was developed is to be able to anticipate with the highest possible accuracy the evasive maneuvers made by a human pilot or in an aircraft facing anti-aircraft fire. And so it was very crucial at the time to be able to anticipate where that pilot would be when they were making what seemed like random evasive maneuvers. And so the servo mechanism was designed for that purpose. And the mathematics behind the servo mechanism, it is partially about carrying some version of a series forward into the future. And it's also because cybernetics gets, as one historian calls it, decontextualized. It gets spread to other areas of understanding, and the notion of the feedback loop that's at the core of cybernetics enters into a lot of other fields. That cybernetics is, I would say, a non-trivial locus of a lot of more contemporary thinking about how the past conditions the future, and this relationship between some predictive desire and some understanding of the past. Dirty data, of course, I imagine you all know something about it, but that's another argument about where taint enters a system. And it speaks to another sub-theme of the project, which is that taint tracing narratives tend to go what I call epistemic very fast, which is to say that they don't remain restricted to a very localized context. They become, taint is oftentimes conceptualized for a local purpose, and then it goes epistemic. And so part of what I want to understand, and this happened with interpretations of dirty data, that dirty data is a driver of epistemic taint. So what I want to understand is this jump from localized to epistemic taint tracing narratives, and that's where you get this sort of all time, all place, all, this much more homogeneous and what I would call chordal in the octopusian and mushroomian vein kind of behavior. And so those are the 4 kind of case studies that I look at. But I think there will also be chapters of the project that will deal with some ideational tendencies, but I won't go too deeply into that here and now unless you're really interested.
Please, you have to raise your hands high. Yeah. because I'm sitting in the sun.
Thank you so much for that fascinating talk. My question, or an idea in search of a question mark, deals with the notion of predictability, /predictability, as a global set, in a sense, or Samuel Moyn and Andrew Sartori talk about in their introduction to global intellectual history, these universals which are then locally predicated. He mentions the Haitian Revolution, the Haitian War of so what I'm trying to say is, because you inspired all of us with your animal metaphors, isn't predictability protean? Isn't predictability then a hydra-like being? Because what is predictable, and especially in the context of the Yugoslav secessionist wars, there are taints which are running at cross purposes, and there are taints which are running parallel. And taints which have shelf lives, and taints which are like sleeper cells, to use a terrorism metaphor.
Yeah.
So how do you make of that? Thank you.
Oh, that's very good. I think I won't be able to give a satisfactory answer, but I have written down the question, and I think it will give me food for thought. And this protean characteristic that you describe, I think the question that I would have that I want to go back to is, to what extent is this tied to the predictability matter? Because you talked about cross purposes. Another aspect of these phenomena that interests me is how oftentimes when something gets what I call operationalized as so some insight gleaned from gathering, let's say, historical information, and then gets fed back into, let's say, some given as an interpretation of the present, or that oftentimes, and you can see this happening in academia often, where it will work, and then it will mean its opposite. And so this tendency of these operationalized insights to flip on themselves is another interesting phenomenon. And when I was talking about another chapter I would write, it would be about this tendency to flip and reverse. Like, for example, the locomotive metaphor for history, or for revolution. Marx says, the revolution is a locomotive. Rosa Luxemburg says, and you have to drive up the hill, full steam ahead, because if you don't get all the way up, you're going to slide back down. And then Benjamin says, well, maybe revolution isn't a locomotive. Maybe it's the emergency brake, that people are pulling on. And then, Vladimir Nabokov said, well, maybe it's the platform that's moving away, And by the time you get to Snowpiercer, the film, the revolution is not on the train. It's anywhere but on the train. And so, the hollowing out of things that become all pervasive, and then, they sort of collapse entirely. And it's this phenomenon, like Huizinga, the Dutch historian, talked about the decline of the Middle Ages. Beginning of the Middle Ages, they torture and kill people, so they will confess, so they will be saved. By the end of the Middle Ages, they just torture and kill people, and they don't allow them to confess. And so something becomes, the practice is the same, but the meaning is exactly the opposite. And this is when I think you can tell that something is ending. And my suspicion is that, we're in such a moment, because if you look at the reflections of these operationalized ideas, you see a lot of tipping, and a lot of people being shocked that all of a sudden everything means the opposite of what it meant before. So yeah, in that respect, yes.
I'm Paul Kemper, professor of modern history at Freie Universität Berlin. You showed us a photograph of Reinhard Koselleck. Koselleck was interested in what he called, or in the relationship between what he called spaces of experiences and horizons of expectations. And this was meant to identify different layers of history, different layers of time, the German word Zeitschichten, so relating the past to the present, and relating the present to the future. And it was also meant to accentuate the role of actors in history and the perspective of observers of history. Do these two concepts and the attempt to investigate the interrelationship between the two concepts make sense with regard to your project of tracing and investigating tainted history?
You mean the...
Could you imagine appropriating to some extent this concept of interrelating spaces of experiences and horizons of expectations? This somewhat takes up the brief discussion about predictability and unpredictability in history.
Yeah, and
so contingency.
Yeah, contingency definitely, and I love reading Koselleck, and he gives much food for thought, and certainly a lot of my thinking has. I mean, he was at the buffet, definitely. The horizons, the space of expectation, and I think what I would say there is that. What I think is sort of like different about that, and this is the first time that I've kind of tried to articulate this, but so I might fall flat. But that there is currently a tendency to think in terms of epistemes, and there's a tendency to suppose that that epistemes exist all around you that maybe aren't yours. And so I think the space of experience or the horizon of expectation in Koselleckian terms depends at least to some extent on relative epistemic homogeneity or the assumption of relative epistemic homogeneity. I think what's happening now is that there is not that assumption of epistemic homogeneity. There is, whether it's true or not, there is an assumption that that epistemes are plural and that the person sitting next to you might have a different one. And in fact, they probably do, or that's the tendency. And I think this actually comes through very smartly, in a way, in Everything Everywhere All at Once, the film. And this that oftentimes one feels like just in order to survive, like you have to jump epistemes, and some weird gesture has to be undertaken, like 5 finger cuts on, 5 paper cuts on all 5 fingers, or something super weird in order to get you into another, set of conditions where you can cope with the situation at hand. And so this notion, first of all, that you can sort of elect your episteme, or that there's a way to get to another one, but that they're inherently plural, this is imminent, I would call it. And this is, it's not that Koselleck, I just think that his world was a bit different. That this is something more recent, and it lacks as yet some terminology to make sense of it. I think you could use Koselleck for making sense of part of it, but there's still some bits that would be hanging out.
Thank you, Holly, for your talk. I'm Jorge Coronado from Northwestern University and a fellow, so we'll talk more about this at breakfast tomorrow, I'm sure. I was struck by 3 moments in your talk, and there are many moments, but they were particularly salient to me. The moment when you speak about the octopus, the moment when you speak about the mushroom, and when you speak about kind of mention Chakrabarti, right? And you're always kind of, at least to me, on the verge of thinking in a way which engages anthropocenic thinking in a deep way, right? But it seems to me that when you get close to it, you tend to pull back. And there may be reasons for that. I think David's question was very telling because you're focusing on particular cases, right? My interest is in asking why not go to the other side of it, right? I mean, it seems to me that, for example, if you're thinking about Chakrabarty and you're thinking about the Anthropocene, the scales of history involved in that sort of thinking about history are really different from the sorts of scales that you're engaging, right, in the project as described, right? Similarly, if you're thinking about mushrooms and octopus, right, I was thinking about Anna Singh, right? I was thinking about Marisol de la Cadena. I was thinking about Eduardo Cohen or Eduardo Viveros de Castro, all anthropologists who are thinking about different epistemologies for understanding the world outside of what would be a sort of European Enlightenment, right, sort of view, right? So is there a way in which you've imagined an exteriority to the way you're thinking about history, right? There's many things engaged there, but for example, right, in mythic thinking amongst certain indigenous groups, right, it's much easier to deal with the time scales involved in the Anthropocene than it is within European Enlightenment thought, where we tend to think in terms of, 100 years, 200 years, 4,000 years, short time periods.
No, that's a good question, and I think the Anthropocene per se is not at the center of the way I conceive of this, because I'm more interested in what the, okay, so the other metaphor that I see coming up, and exteriority, let's start with that, because the very notion that there is something exterior, like this is sort of the, in some respects, this is the old dream of the Archimedean point, that you can get outside in order to be able to see better. And then the whole, series of questions come, what are you outside of? And what are you seeing better? And whose transformation is being achieved by, these. And one of the things that people at the buffet, the ghosts, were preoccupied with is this, no, there's no outside. You are in this. And one of the increasing, I think, and this is what, be it Anthropocene or leftist thinking, or is that the notion that you can actually sort of get out has a lot of it's troubled historically, but I also think that it exists as a dream. And I think it exists partially as a dream for the same reasons that people are constantly trying to find a place that isn't tainted, or a mode that isn't impure, or that has not been touched. And I think what's fascinating, I think this is a preoccupation historically of anthropology. To try to find the thing that hasn't been ruined or that hasn't been destroyed by the gaze, or by the, and ironically, kind of through the gaze tries to get beyond it. And so I think I need to think about this matter some more. But one thing that I would like to thematize is the matter of what happened to the idea of of outside. Because I think a lot of presumptions that we have about inner transformation presuppose that you're able to be outside. If just in a very banal terms, like if you think of A Christmas Carol, and when Ebenezer Scrooge is seeing himself, that's when he has the big wake-up moment. But he has to see himself as if from the outside. And so this notion that, no, you're in it. And Kafka thematized this as well. He has this piece called He, where he says, I just want to jump out of the fighting line. I don't want to be stuck between past and future. I don't want to be in this. But, this is one of the presumptions of the 19th century is that, that was bad faith. It was bad faith to presume that you could get out. Good faith, and this comes back to Marxism, is to note that you are in it, and you are part of it, and you are doing it. And so even if you'd like to get out, like this is the fact of your existence. And so I'm still fascinated by, the transformative potential that is still seen and that is still sought in this outside move, because I have sympathy for it, frankly. And, the sediments of time, the fossils, like the ideas of getting outside of a particular concept of time, etc. I'm incredibly attracted to those ideas. But I think I haven't yet decided how I feel about my attraction.
Thank you. I think we might want to speed up a bit or keep it short.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
No, just for questions to have room. Please, yes, in the back. Yeah.
Thank you. This is really enjoyable for me. I come at this with as a student of literature, and your talk reminds me of a book I read long ago about the prophetic voice in literature. I'm not sure why, but my question goes to your process of writing. Maybe it's two questions. First, are you going to illustrate your book yourself? But more seriously, are you drawn to? You've used examples like Kafka and Dickens. Are you drawn to something more? What's the word I'm looking for? Literary narrative, fiction, dare one say, or poetry even? Because you have a poetic voice, it seems to me.
Oh, thank you. I wish, that would be great. I think I suck. At that. But yes, I actually think that a lot of the things I want to do, I'm not sure that you can do them with history, and I'm not sure, but I'm not sure that I can do them not history. So I'm in a bind. But definitely, literature is able to do so many things without being explicit about them, and that's such an important function when you're trying to capture a plurality. Like Christa Wolf had this line that I really liked. She said, "I'm jealous of painters because they get to show everything at once." And there's nothing, I oftentimes genuinely feel trapped in a historian's body, rattling my cage for that very reason, because you can't do that. But I feel pretty lucky to be here, at least around people who can. I'm hoping, after my incredibly successful debut as a cartoonist. Yeah, maybe I take off.
I have 3 more questions. I would suggest taking all 3.
Oh, bundling, yeah. Let's do it.
Thank you for talking about history so openly. I have perhaps a specific and perhaps simplifying question. I read a lot in East European discussions, and particularly specifically Ukrainian discussions, that Western academia, Western community of experts failed to predict 2 most important changes in Eastern Europe: the collapse of Soviet Union and Soviet bloc, and the growth of Russian imperialism and invasion of Ukraine. And the question would be, were this because these people were too contaminated by history, or were that was because they were too immune to contamination? Perhaps certain element of contamination could be helpful. Maybe not. I'm wondering.
Yeah, thank you for all your great insights. My question would actually be, you speak of taint as if it were a fact, as if it were something objective, while, of course, at the end, you flip it. So my question would be, in how far are you looking at the role of the observer in your work? Same as with quantum, you only know where a particle is, either where it is in space at a certain point of time, or how fast it is going, but you can't do both of the same. So by actually looking at it, you change it. So What's your perspective on that? Thank you.
Really easy questions, thanks.
And at the end, a suggestion. Eric Lindner of the Axel Springer Foundation. I remember Neil McGregor's The History of the World in 100 Objects. And I would like to suggest to you and the other fellows of the Academy to write the history of the future in 100 topics or objects, maybe in the age of 2048 and 50 years of American Academy here. And I think you can do it.
Great. So thank you so much. One of the things that I was originally going to talk about was the Sonderweg, because I think it's interesting. And then Beata, I think, rightfully said, "Oh, come on, everyone's heard so much about the Sonderweg, they don't want to." But the Sonderweg is interesting to me. This is an answer to Ostap's question in an oblique way, because to me is that it has contingency in it, but it's contingency in the past. And, you know, like, so something could have been otherwise, but wasn't. And one of the things about taint tracing narratives is that oftentimes they can't imagine contingency. So when you're a historian, you have like maybe two pieties. And one of them is that you have to be able to trace the origins of things, and especially bad things. So taint tracing is incredibly important. But the other thing you care about is contingency. That not everything is determined, and that things are unpredictable to some extent, and that you don't know what's going to come next. And so how is contingency and taint tracing, like how can you do both of those at the same time? Because they seem to be mutually exclusive. And so one of the methodological things that I'm interested in, because I see the value of both of these things. But oftentimes, in retrospect, and particularly in politics, the sense is generally, no, there was a right way and a wrong way. And so you can't recover that moment of contingency. It's sort of lost to history. Or if there was one, it's kind of lost. And this is why the Sonderweg interests me, because it's so weird. Like, what a weird idea. Because it says there was contingency, but it's already over in the past. And so it's like this kind of, I want to have both of these things, but it's not like it's an answer. I find it a very human and therefore poignant answer to managing these like unpredictabilities where even you, like who wanted contingency over and over, it's better if it's not the way that I fear, but at some point you have to say, no, this, the thing that living in time sort of constantly teaches you is that you're often wrong. You will have been wrong. This was something that I thought was interesting in Germany during the pandemic, that I think the health minister said something like this at the outset of the pandemic. We will have been wrong in some of our policies and decisions. And I wonder what sort of sensibility that is. The jury's still out on that. I think it's interesting. It's humble. It's fascinating, but it's also kind of a cop-out for some purposes. But I wonder what kind of sensibility one should have towards contingency. I wish that the people who thought that there was a chance for the trajectory with Russia and Ukraine to have gone differently were right. They were not. And I guess the question is, does that mean there was no chance? Does that mean that whatever anybody did, it was going to be like this? And so where do we locate any contingency is a real question in my mind, and one that I think methodologically historians might we might do better to consider the ramifications of those two contrary wishes, which are sort of like the two contrary wishes that we have about heaven itself, that the last will be first and the first will be last, and the wolf will lie down with the lamb. You can't have them both. But they're both there. And so I think this goes very much to the heart of a methodological concern. Looking at I think you've caught me in the, because there's a great author I like a lot who says that, when she's thinking about the history of AI and reading all of these thinkers, she oftentimes doesn't feel like she can say anything, or she starts to say something and then, like it sort of escapes her grasp. And she says the only way that she can get, like to manage to complete a thought is to use the word I, to assume a point of view. And this is her solution. I have not yet found mine for this project, but the question is real. I think for my last project, what I did is I assumed 6 positions, and I narrated around, and I showed the overlap between them. I tried to get some other, like not without position, but what happens when your positions are plural, and you really run with them. But I don't know what I'm going to do on this one, but it's not a trivial problem. So thank you for raising it, however painfully. Oh yes, yeah, we're on it tomorrow at breakfast. Yeah. Thank you.